I'd been dreaming of this day for as long as I could remember. The perfect wedding, the fairy tale honeymoon. And here I was, walking down the sand-lined aisle in a whisper of white lace, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting golden light on everything. Everyone saw us as the perfect couple, but, of course, everyone was wrong. For a moment, the thought made me smile, a smile only I understood, a secret as dark as the ocean at midnight. The trip to the island was supposed to be our fresh start, a chance to leave the past behind, to build on the promises we'd made. At least that's what Peter kept saying, clasping my hands with that charming, disarming smile I once thought was genuine. Only this time, I knew better. He didn't see how my smile didn't reach my eyes, or the way my hands trembled, not with excitement, but with anticipation. The island resort was picturesque, a perfect paradise, but to me, it felt more like a stage for an ending rather than a beginning. In our suite that first night, I toasted to us, to our forever, while Peter's gaze roamed the room, missing the chill in my voice. It was surreal, standing there, looking at him through a veil of memories, images of the betrayals and lies he'd woven so artfully into our story, convincing everyone he was the devoted groom to be. By the third day, we'd fallen into a routine, swimming at dawn, breakfast on the beach, and drinks at sunset. But it was all a mask, a fragile, glittering facade that hid the truth. Peter thought he was safe here, isolated on a remote island, where I'd have no choice but to give him another chance. Little did he know, I had no intentions of giving him anything at all. On our final night, I led him out to a secluded cove under the pretense of a surprise. His curiosity flared, just as I'd expected. We walked in silence, waves crashing softly around us, his arm around my shoulders, holding me close. It almost felt real for a second, the way he held me. But I reminded myself of every single lie, of the hollow promises he made to my face while betraying me behind my back. When we reached the cove, the water was a sheet of silver under the full moon. He stood by the edge, looking out, likely marveling at his charm and confidence, probably imagining the ways he could spin this trip into his final apology. I took a step closer and felt the cool, hard metal in my hand. "Peter," I said softly, drawing his attention. As he turned, my heart raced, knowing that this was it, the end I had planned. His eyes widened as he saw the knife. His smug expression vanished, replaced by something between confusion and terror. What are you doing?" His voice faltered, uncharacteristically unsure, and I felt a thrill knowing he had no control now, no way to twist my actions or words. I was silent, letting him soak in the gravity of the moment. "Please, I can explain," he began, taking a step back, his charm suddenly useless, but explanations were no longer needed. With one fluid motion, I cut through the last bond that tied us together. His body fell, limp, the water instantly staining with blood, carrying it out to sea as if erasing him from my life, our story, my memories. I watched for a moment as the waves took him, the water shimmering crimson under the moonlight. For the first time in years, I felt free, the shackles of deception shattered in an instant. As I walked back to our suite, I let the salty night air fill my lungs. The authorities would arrive eventually, but by then I'd have already been long gone, leaving no trace of my last act as his bride. The bride he thought he could deceive forever. I hadn't planned on staying a minute longer than necessary. My bags were packed, and the speedboat waited just a short walk down the beach. The resort staff, who'd been attending to our every need, wouldn't notice I was missing until morning. They'd chalk it up to a couple spending a long night in paradise. By the time anyone thought to look for Peter, it'd be too late. The currents here were strong, almost predatory. He'd be nothing but a memory, pulled away by the tide. As I made my way to the boat, the calmness in me felt surreal, like I was floating through someone else's story. I barely felt the sand between my toes or the humid air clinging to my skin. With each step, I left pieces of my old self behind, the woman who'd fallen for Peter's hollow words, the girl who once believed in happily ever after. The captain greeted me with a nod as I climbed aboard. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer any answers. I settled into a seat as we sped across the water, the island growing smaller and smaller behind us, until it was just a dark shape against the sky. I stared ahead, watching the waves slice cleanly around the boat, feeling lighter with every mile. But by dawn, things had changed. I'd checked into a modest hotel on the mainland, thinking my escape flawless. But when I flipped on the news in my room that morning, Peter's face filled the screen, his photo bright and crisp, beside the words, "Missing Groom discovered dead on Honeymoon Island." My heart thudded once, hard and fast, at the unexpected headline. I'd been so careful. I'd left him in the shallows, far from the prying eyes of resort guests. But the ocean had its own plans, delivering him back to shore as if my secret was never meant to stay hidden. Within hours, the headlines were everywhere. Every major channel, every tabloid, even social media. Rumors flared about our perfect honeymoon turned tragic, each story twisting the narrative in a new way. I watched, fascinated and terrified, as strangers picked apart the details of my life, my marriage, my motives. Peter had friends in high places, and his connections painted him as the golden boy, the loving husband who'd been tragically lost at sea. Then, the police report mentioned something I hadn't expected. They had found bruises, defensive marks, they said. There was speculation, talk of a possible altercation. The water had kept its secrets for only so long, and just like that, I became the prime suspect. There were whispers of an investigation, possible extradition if it came to that. Reporters were digging into my past, trying to construct a motive, painting me as a grieving widow with a dark side, the bride who'd harbored a vendetta. The phone on the bedside table rang, jolting me from my daze. I let it ring once, twice, knowing instinctively who it was. An officer from the island resort was on the other end, his voice formal, but laced with an edge I couldn't ignore. He wanted to ask a few questions. I had been the last to see Peter alive, after all. In that moment, I knew my escape plan was crumbling. But there was no time to panic, no room for regret. I forced myself to stay calm, to steady my breath as I spoke to the officer, answering each question with practiced composure, weaving a story that would leave no doubt in his mind. I was the widow, the grieving bride, nothing more. But as I hung up, I could feel the net tightening around me, the shadows of my past closing in like the waves that had betrayed me. I was no longer the woman with the perfect escape plan, but something else, a hunted figure with secrets too dark to bury. The following days were a blur of forced composure, as detectives circled me like hawks. I'd perfected the grieving widow's mask, my voice breaking on cue when they asked about Peter's tragic accident. But the questions kept coming, digging deeper with each interview, each clarification. Every interaction felt like a test, a new chance for me to falter. And despite my training, my control was beginning to slip. One afternoon, a detective named Foster arrived. He was younger than the rest, but something in his eyes told me he wasn't easily fooled. As he sat across from me, he seemed more interested in what I didn't say, watching every shift in my gaze, every pause. "So, you and Peter. It sounds like a fairy tale," he said, his voice light but probing. But even fairy tales have villains. Were there ever problems between you? I paused, feigning a wounded look, hoping he'd see it as grief rather than hesitation. We were happy, I murmured. Or at least, I thought we were. His expression didn't change, but I could feel his scrutiny sharpen. So, you were alone on the beach that night? Yes, I replied, my voice firm. I had rehearsed this part countless times. I told him how Peter had gone for a late swim, how I'd drifted off to sleep in our suite, only to wake up and find him missing. It was a lie, woven tightly into the truth, but one slip could unravel it all. Foster nodded, scribbling in his notebook. Strange, though. A strong swimmer like Peter wouldn't have ventured into those waters alone, especially that late. His eyes caught mine, and I forced myself not to look away. There was a storm coming that night, wasn't there? I froze, feeling a sudden icy panic. Yes, but we didn't realize how rough it would get, I said, quickly recovering. I thought he'd be safe. Foster's gaze lingered on me a moment longer before he closed his notebook. Of course. I'm sure you loved him very much, he said with a tight smile that felt like a dare. When he finally left, my hands were shaking. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the room, his gaze, the suffocating fear that was creeping into my carefully composed world. But that night, my sleep was restless, haunted by memories I'd tried to bury. Days later, the tension became unbearable. Foster's visits became more frequent, his questions more invasive, as if he knew I was hiding something and just needed me to slip. Then, one evening, I received a message at the hotel front desk. I unfolded it, expecting another police notice, but it wasn't. Meet me at the old pier at midnight. No name, no explanation, just a time and place. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read it. Every instinct told me not to go, to avoid the trap, but some dark curiosity, or maybe the need to finally end this ordeal, drove me there. The pier was desolate, the wood creaking underfoot, the scent of salt and decay heavy in the air. I saw a shadowy figure waiting, hands buried in his pockets. As I got closer, the figure stepped into the dim moonlight, and I recognized Foster's face, cold and resolute. "You've been playing quite a role, haven't you?" he said, his tone flat but laced with accusation. "But you can't keep this up forever." "I don't know what you mean," I replied, my voice steady, refusing to give him anything. I'd come too far to slip now, but he stepped closer, his face inches from mine. "I know. You know. And it's only a matter of time before everyone else does too. The truth has a way of coming to the surface, just like Peter's body." His gaze was unflinching, piercing through every wall I'd built. I felt myself waver, the fear rising, consuming me. But I forced myself to smile, cold and practiced. "Then prove it," I whispered, my voice daring, though my heart pounded wildly. Foster's eyes narrowed. For a moment, the air between us was thick with tension, with unspoken threats. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his silhouette swallowed by the shadows of the pier. I stayed, my heart racing, the silence pressing down on me. He was right. I was playing a role, and with each passing day, my stage was collapsing. As I turned back toward the hotel, the waves crashed louder against the pier, as if echoing my own dark fears. I was running out of time, and soon, the truth I'd tried so hard to bury would come to the surface, no matter what it destroyed in the process. Days passed, and Foster's relentless pursuit left me feeling like a caged animal. Every knock on the door, every ringing phone felt like the countdown to my undoing. My lies, which once felt seamless, were fraying around the edges, stretching thin under Foster's gaze. Each time he questioned me, he left a little more doubt, a crack in my story that widened each time he looked at me with those sharp, unyielding eyes. Then one morning, my phone buzzed with a message. This time, it wasn't a meeting or a warning. It was a simple message from the local police, instructing me to come down to the station. Just a few final questions, they'd said. My heart pounded as I dressed, knowing this would be no ordinary conversation. At the station, they led me into a sterile, cramped interrogation room, a fluorescent light buzzing overhead. The air was cold, making my skin prickle. Foster sat across from me, a thick file on the table between us. He flipped it open, revealing photos of Peter, photos I hadn't seen before. The last moments of his life captured on film, his face as lifeless as the ocean that had betrayed him. "We've looked into your relationship," Foster began, his voice calm but ruthless. "We spoke with some of Peter's friends. They mentioned troubles between you two. They mentioned you'd recently found out about his indiscretions." My stomach churned. I could feel the walls closing in, his words pressing in on all sides. I opened my mouth to protest, to spin some final story, but the weight of it all bore down on me. Every lie, every half-truth felt like stones on my chest. Foster leaned forward, watching me intently. "People do desperate things in love, don't they?" he said, his tone almost sympathetic. "When you found out, I can only imagine how hurt you felt, how betrayed." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But killing him? That's a step few are willing to take. Unless, of course, there was no other choice." His words struck something deep inside me, a raw, festering wound I could no longer ignore. I felt my carefully built mask crumble, leaving nothing but the fragile truth. The weight of it had become too much to bear. "Yes," I whispered, the confession escaping my lips before I could stop it. I knew. I knew about everything. I knew about the lies, the betrayal. My voice cracked, the dam of emotions breaking free. He had it all planned, you know. This whole honeymoon, this picture-perfect story. It was all his way of keeping me silent, of keeping his secrets hidden. Foster nodded, giving me room to continue. I loved him once, or at least, I loved the idea of him. But the man he became, the one who thought he could control everything. My hands trembled, and I clenched them tightly. I knew what he was capable of, and I knew he'd never let me go. So I made the choice for him. I took back control. Silence filled the room as I processed what I'd just admitted. It was like the air had been sucked out, the confession hanging between us like a storm cloud, ready to break. Foster sat back, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for telling the truth," he said, his tone softer than I expected. "Sometimes it takes more strength to admit what's been hidden than to keep it buried." I couldn't tell if his words were sincere or simply part of his routine, but at that moment, I didn't care. The confession had freed me, in a twisted way, from the suffocating weight I'd carried alone. Foster closed the file, signaling the end of the interview. As they led me away, I felt a strange calm settle over me. There would be no more pretending, no more lying. The truth was out now, and the story of a bride who'd exacted her final revenge, had finally reached its end. The trial was swift. News of my confession spread quickly, sensationalized in headlines that painted me as a bride scorned, a woman betrayed, driven to deadly lengths by love twisted into rage. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with whispers as I walked in, my wrists bound, a chill settling over me. Reporters snapped photos, capturing the face of the woman who'd turned her honeymoon into a murder scene. Foster was there, seated among the witnesses, his gaze steady. He'd been relentless, pressing me until I finally broke, and in some strange way, I was grateful to him. The weight of the secrets I'd buried had grown unbearable, pressing down until I could hardly breathe. My confession felt like stepping out of darkness into light, and I could almost feel his respect, his silent acknowledgement of the strength it took to admit my truth. The prosecution presented its case ruthlessly, showing the jury photos of Peter's body, playing recordings of my confessions. I could barely recognize my own voice, cold and broken, as it recounted the deception, the lies, and finally, the moment I'd chosen freedom over fear. But the defense countered with another narrative, painting Peter as a master manipulator who'd lured me into a toxic marriage, a man whose secrets were as deep as the ocean that had swallowed him. They argued that my confession had been an act of catharsis, a final reckoning with the betrayal that had stripped me of my trust, my life, my love. My lawyer described me not as a villain, but as a victim who'd snapped under the weight of unbearable truths. Then, the jury deliberated. Hours stretched into days, every second ticking louder than the last. I sat alone in my cell, staring out through narrow bars at a bleak, gray sky. Regret gnawed at me, questions looping endlessly in my mind. Had there been another way? Could I have escaped him without blood on my hands? But each time I came back to the same conclusion. He'd never have let me go. I'd taken the only path left. On the third day, they reached a verdict. The judge's voice was steady as she spoke, her words slicing through the silence of the courtroom. For the charge of voluntary manslaughter, she said, her tone solemn, we find the defendant guilty. There was a collective murmur, a hum of finality. I felt the verdict settle over me, heavy and unchangeable, yet strangely liberating. I'd taken control, and now I was finally free of Peter, even if it meant a freedom confined to prison walls. The sentence was pronounced. 15 years. 15 years to reckon with the choice I'd made. I would spend my days enclosed, but my mind, my heart, would finally be my own. No more lies, no more fear. Just the simple, painful truth, sitting bare beneath fluorescent lights and the echoes of steel doors. As they led me out, I caught Foster's eye one last time. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement, not of approval, but of understanding. In his eyes, I saw a glimmer of something close to respect. I walked past him without a word, feeling the weight of each step as I left the courtroom. Outside, the reporters shouted my name, cameras flashing, but their voices faded as I looked up at the open sky above the prison yard, my final destination. I took a deep breath, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a strange, twisted sense of peace. I was guilty, yes, but I was finally free.